in planning today and tomorrow's events, the great Tricia Rose and Jordan Camp and I wanted to encourage the prospect that this could be a different kind of meeting, that we could imbue the world with the possibility of making right things come to pass by using this time in the most productive way. And so I'm not up here saying, I'm not going to give one of those keynotes that says, I've got it right, although I am trying to be right. But I'm giving a keynote that I hope will set the stage for the important work that we have to do. As individuals and as a society, we have not yet come to grips with the meaning of the last 10 years. The way in which Hurricane Katrina, on the one hand, exposed the cruelty, the callousness, the avaricious abandonment of entire populations, but on the other hand, so discredited the people in power that they've been lying about it ever since. So discredited the people in power that when the economy collapsed because of predatory lending and mortgage fraud, when Trayvon Martin was killed, when Rekia Boyd was murdered, when Sandra Bland her death was orchestrated in a Texas jail, people responded not with patience and not with credulity, but with mobilizing in the streets and realizing that nobody would do for them what they fail to do for themselves. So we're in a different moment, and we're in a different moment because of the last 10 years, because of what happened and didn't happen in August and September of 2005. And what we do with that story matters a great deal. In the months and days ahead, we're going to be asked to have degrees, to muster from within ourselves, degrees of courage and clarity and conviction that I think many of us fear that we don't have. And so the question is, how do we put ourselves in shape to deal with the hand that history has dealt us at this moment? We have to be in shape to carry on the activities that will enable us to respond honorably and honestly and effectively to the ultimate meaning of the genocide on the installment plan, the apocalypse that's going on all around us of mass incarceration and sexual violence and hunger, artificial austerity, warfare, anti-immigrant nativism. These things are not here by accident. They're part of a systemic breakdown of the major institutions in society, a breakdown that was signaled and is encapsulated in what happened in response to Hurricane Katrina. And so we need to draw on any tradition we can. And what we're hoping is that the next 2 days will not only give us something to feel, but many different things to do. That we will not just accompany each other in this room as spectators and speakers for a few hours, but that we'll take the first step in walking down the road together, differently positioned though we are, differently situated in this society, but recognizing that we have a linked fate. And if one loses, all loses. And we have to find a way to work together. In the music tradition that trained Ernie K. Doe, the performance tradition that Sonny represented so brilliantly this afternoon, the key factors have often been practice, accompaniment, and improvisation. Practice in the sense of you have to get ready. If you can get ready, if you can be ready, you don't have to get ready. As I said, practice will put us in shape to do difficult things. Now, there's always a disagreement about what it means to be in shape. The basketball player Charles Barkley always used to resent it when his teammates said that he was not in shape because, as Barkley explained it, round was also a shape. But for us, being in shape means learning to listen, developing out of friendliness, humility, and respect, a way of working together on these life and death issues, and accompaniment is an important part of that. That when you accompany, it doesn't necessarily mean that you play the solo and somebody's in the background, or you're in the background and somebody plays the solo. Accompaniment in music means that people have to listen with their third ear and see with their third eye and be attentive to what's happening all around them and figure out a way to move together. And of course, it requires improvisation. It means that we have to invent things that aren't yet here. Now, I think the framing for this is for us to understand that Katrina was not an event. It was a hegemonic conjuncture. It was one of those moments in history where a lot of different things came together, and nothing has been the same ever since. That with Katrina, people were able to see what had been in place for a long time, and that is these systematic practices of displacement, of dispossession, of disempowerment, organized abandonment of whole populations, calculated cruelty, the link between criminalization and mass incarceration, and a new agenda of privatization and plunder. But it was also an oppositional conjuncture. It's one of those moments in history, one of those turning points from which there's no turning back. It's like 1927, the night when Sacco and Vanzetti were executed by the state, and a whole generation of white ethnic immigrants realized they could no longer depend upon the paternalism and the benevolence of the boss, but they had to go out in a mass movement in the CIO organizing drives and transform the society. It's like that afternoon in 1955 when a jury acquitted the killers of Emmett Till. An entire generation of black people recognized that they had to mobilize for themselves because the system would wink at even the most overt, grotesque kinds of murder. And so this is one of those moments. An oppositional conjuncture is an event that encapsulates, distills, and crystallizes a complex history. Many different paths to Katrina, many different optics on it. But all of these seem to come together in a representative institute that stands for a need to do something different. I also want to emphasize that it was an occurrence that exposed not only the calculated cruelty, but the mendacity of those in power. Maybe the ultimate legacy of slavery in this country is not just dehumanization and brutalization and racism, but that a deeply ingrained ability to live with evil and then learn to lie it away, to pretend that it doesn't exist. But there are moments when the veil falls off, when the lie is exposed, when the nakedness of the official story is so clear that, in fact, it discredits the people speaking it, even if they remain in power. They lose the moral authority, they lose the credibility with the masses that it appeared they had beforehand. And I think for black people and for all lovers of freedom and dignity of humans, this was an injury that portends an unlivable destiny. And I think this is what we have to come to grips with. When we see masses in motion in the streets today, parents and teachers staging a hunger strike at Dyett High School in Chicago, homeless people today organizing in Los Angeles, demanding a new social contract, a new compact about where money is going to be spent. When the mass activity we've seen with the killings of Eric Garner and Freddie Gray and Michael Brown, people aren't saying we want things to be a little better. They're not saying their backs are against the wall. They're saying their backs are being pushed through the wall, that they're being given an unlivable destiny. And resistance is not an option, but a necessity. And I think Katrina, along with the killing of Trayvon Martin and so much of what we've seen over the last 10 years, is perceived as an insult that requires a collective response. There's no private peace. There's no individual way out of this conjuncture. And of course, Sonny mentioned we need to see this through the eyes of Clyde Woods, who is no longer here but is always here. Almost immediately after the hurricane, the experts in legitimation, the movers and shakers of this world, had a story about what was going to happen. Clyde had a different story. Clyde said, don't think of New Orleans as a site of exceptional tragedy. Don't think of New Orleans as a place left out of history. He said, in fact, New Orleans is our future. It's the crucible and laboratory for new forms of a fully linked, devolved system of austerity and brutality that will soon be everywhere. And so when Sonny quotes Dr. King saying an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere, this isn't just for Clyde a philosophical principle. For Clyde, it meant that a grievous imbalance of power that isn't addressed in one place will spread everywhere because it's a test case, it's a testing ground for how far the people in power can go. And in those cases, it falls to the people on the front lines, the eyewitnesses to this displacement and dispossession, to devise the solutions. So just as it was Mayan peasants in the jungle, the Lacandon jungles in Chiapas, Mexico, who in 1994 took up arms because they recognized before anyone else what the North American Free Trade Agreement was going to mean. It's fallen to the people of New Orleans, to the organizers who are in this room and their comrades in struggle, to analyze and to find remedies for the forms of neoliberal racist dispossession, incarceration, privatization, and plunder that are going on. So in a way, you know, my title is a play on the Fats Domino song, Walking to New Orleans. But at this point, I think walking with New Orleans is our greatest imperative. So the new battle of New Orleans is a fight to control the story and its significance. The suffering that Sonny so brilliantly delineated in her art and artistry, and the struggle against it, means that there needs to be containment on the part of those in power. It is the most important thing, keeping power in place in our day, is a lie told about Katrina, its aftermath, and its consequences. And you're not going to challenge the established power that exists unless you take apart that lie, unless you address its slogans, unless you see what is meant by choice, what is meant by resilience, what is meant by privatization. So the event itself forced a decisive break with the past that rendered previous attitudes, opinions, and ideas obsolete. And it provoked people to produce new ways of knowing, thinking, and being. Terrible ways of knowing, thinking, and being, but that then provokes a response of emancipatory and liberatory ways of thinking and being. So this is Congressman Richard Baker, almost from Shreveport, almost as soon as the hurricane hit. He said, we couldn't get rid of public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did it. How pleased God must have been by that acknowledgement, that the thing to celebrate in this enormous suffering was that public housing could now be destroyed in New Orleans. 1 month later, Alphonso Jackson, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Bush administration, said, I'm telling you as a developer and as Secretary of HUD, that New Orleans is not going to be as black as it was for a long time, if ever again. So immediately there was an agenda underway. Immediately there was an attempt at a kind of looting that never gets described as looting, but is obviously much more efficient and much more profitable. Just last month, Kristen McQuarrie, who writes under the name the State House Chick for the Chicago Tribune, said that Chicago, in the 10th anniversary of Katrina, made her realize that Chicago needed what happened in New Orleans. She says, I find myself wishing for a storm. That's what it took to set the reset button in New Orleans. Chaos, tragedy, heartbreak. And she said, New Orleans has balanced its budget and created charter schools, fired union teachers, taken the school system out of the hands of the parents, and that's all worth it to have a hurricane in which people are killed, in which people die, in which neighborhoods that have existed for 7 generations get destroyed. We have to understand that this is a kind of opportunism, but it also is a very revealing exposure of the morality of neoliberalism, of a society in which property is so much more important than people, and a society that increasingly divides the world into a small group of people who are exceptional and the masses who are considered disposable. This is not an offhand comment. This is something that was nurtured and sustained by think tanks, by a public relations campaign. Kristen McQuarrie did not wake up one day and think about this. David Brooks had a column saying this on September 5th, 2005 in the New York Times. The Koch brothers have convened sessions all around the country to advance an argument around this, to basically at the scene of argument create a society to which there is no alternative. And then Arne Duncan, Obama's Secretary of Education, says that Katrina was the best thing that happened to the education system in New Orleans. This is the same Arne Duncan who, in Atlanta on the anniversary on Dr. King Day, said that the one thing Dr. King would want black students to do is to compete and succeed and join in the race to the top in the school system. The Dr. King who said that a sanitation worker is as important as a physician. The Dr. King who said that the person who went to Morehouse is no more important than the person who has no house. Arne Duncan imagines that he would want black youth to think competing and winning is the most important thing. This has been the architect of the current administration's education system. And then Malcolm Gladwell in The New Yorker has an article about how great Katrina was, how beneficial it was to the people who were displaced. And he says, you know, for sentimental reasons, people might want to live in a neighborhood and continue the practices, but Katrina proves it's better for them to be forced out and to go to places where they can live better. Now understand, this is New Orleans. This is the Ninth Ward. This is places where parish lines determine intergenerational relations. This is a place that we know. We know this place. This place is only a market site in the eyes of Malcolm Gladwell. It's not a historical site, a social site, a spiritual site. It's a place to be destroyed. So we know this place. Not only the place of New Orleans, but the place of these systemic lies being told to cover over the ultimate in political evil. This is a place where the slave market that Sunny referenced in her talk was a situation where enslaved people in the coffle and in the slave market were expected to perform docility in the eyes of people wishing to own them. And the people wishing to own them imagined a plenitude, a fulfillment, a control in which owning slaves would make them more important. This quote is from the great Walter Johnson, whose book Soul by Soul is about the slave market in New Orleans. And he says of white people at the slave market, their selves were built out of slaves. They knew who they were because of who they own. And this is something that has not gone away, something that did not disappear. And of course, the people lining up to be sold did not conform to the imagined role that white supremacy had laid out for them. They resisted in all kinds of ways, and that produced what Johnson describes as a homicidal rage in the slave owner. The brutality of the slave owner was not simply to preserve property, because after all, why would you beat or kill property that you invested in? Johnson says the brutality of it came from the insult of humans refusing to be property, of subjects refusing to be objects, and the threat this was to a damaged white psyche that depended upon white supremacy for identity. In all societies, Stalabras and White tell us the socially peripheral is symbolically central. So people who appear to be on the margins, the people with non-normative sexualities, the hustlers, the transgender people, the impoverished, the homeless, the immigrant. These are not people who seem to have a lot of power, don't seem to be important in society. Symbolically, they are hugely important to the power structure because the power structure constructs itself against allegedly non-normative others. And this is part of why the people of New Orleans have to be punished in the eyes of neoliberal movers and shakers because they refuse to disavow identities that are seen as non-normative, that are seen as unproductive, that don't fit the logic of capitalist accumulation. So what we have in the slave market in the 1850s and in the last 10 years is another vestige of slavery unable to die. Johnson says the greater the transformative hope slaveholders took with them to the slave market, the more violent their reactions to the inevitable disappointment of their efforts to get real slaves to act like imagined ones. If they had to, they would use brutality to close the distance between the roles they imagined for themselves and the failings of the slaves they bought as props for their performance. So everything from the demonization of inner city youth, the cruel and criminal attacks on black mothers with children, on the alleged sexual non-normativity of black people, the attacks on transgender gay and lesbian people, the contempt for the poor, but also the celebration of the black celebrity, the Condoleezza Rice, the Oprah Winfrey, the Barack Obama. All of these are designed to create a racial diorama, a racial show. And when live humans do not conform to that imagination, the system doesn't say we've got it wrong. You know, you can't cure poverty by telling young men to pull up their pants. You can't tell people to get married and they'll be wealthy when they don't make a living wage and it makes more sense to have children while they're still living at home. You can't put bow ties and jackets on young boys who are living near toxic waste dumps and are told by every institution in this society that they're everyone's lowest priority. You can't sermonize your way out of inequality and injustice. And when that turns out not to be true, they don't rethink the thing. They feel furious at the people who are the objects of these policies. And this is what we're up against. It's a long history that also relates to New Orleans, going back to Plessy v. Ferguson, living with evil and lying about it, pretending things are equal when they're not, pretending that we're all included in this society when only a few people have the right to determine who's included, who's excluded, what are the terms of inclusion, what's the pace of inclusion, what's the behavior needed to maintain inclusion. This is all held by a small monopoly in this society. Louisiana has been a laboratory for the policies that both political parties believe in and that are falling apart, that have destroyed the economy, the environment, the educational system, that because they create a nation maddened by its own contradictions, is wreaking havoc on violence all around the world. One of the laboratories for this was the state of Louisiana, where low wages, high profits, shredded social safety net, viewing people with problems as the problem, this has now spread nationally and globally. This is David Treen, former governor of Louisiana, who Edwin Edwards used to say, David Treen is so slow it takes him an hour and a half to watch 60 Minutes. But you don't have to be sharp to run this system. In fact, it's better if you're not. So New Orleans, Louisiana, the US has become an example to the world through deregulation, tax subsidies, ecologically unsound development, broken windows policing, mass incarceration, draconian reductions in social spending, union busting, privatization of public education. It's a long list. What's important to me is that at the university, we not see this as something that it's out there. It's in here. This is Daniel Patrick Moynihan on the left, James Q. Wilson on the right. These are the architects and experts in legitimation of policies that are destroying this society. And in the university, those of us who are teachers, those of us who are students, those of us who are connected to institutions like Brown University need to come to grips with what is the terms of our existence and how do we relate to what has happened in New Orleans, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Baltimore, in St. Louis, in cities all over this nation and all over this world. The university is not an innocent victim of neoliberalism. We don't have a spectatorial window out into the world of neoliberalism. We work at institutions that are the prime architects of these policies, the prime theorists of these policies, and the prime apologists for it. And if we don't take this on inside the university as well as outside, we're not doing our job. We can't, I'm going to make an appeal later on that we get involved in things outside the university, that academics be expert witnesses, that they file friend of the court briefs, that they do research for community organizations, that they turn over the publication sites and the speakers funds that we have to groups that need it. But I don't want people to think that this means we don't have important work to do in the university, because this poison is nurtured and sustained and developed here. And we are rewarded for ever more eloquent or indignant descriptions of other people's suffering, but do nothing about that suffering itself. And that puts us in what I think is an intolerable intellectual position as well as an intolerable moral position. And so Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you know, in 1965 comes along and says that black poverty isn't a result of racism, it's not a result of discrimination, it's a result of a tangle of pathologies, namely that black women are too strong and black men have been emasculated. And so therefore the way to help the black community is to suppress black women, to repress those alternate forms of family formation. God help us, don't let lesbians adopt. You know, let's imagine a two-parent home with a father in the home who's the parent, even though we're not providing the limited wages for that person to inhabit that role, in a role which doesn't even exist in white families. But Moynihan comes along and says it's a gender problem, not a race problem. And much social policy proceeds from that assumption. And it proceeds on the right with the attacks on welfare, and particularly the attacks on black women. But it also comes from the liberals. What is Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative about but marginalizing and erasing the conditions that black women share with black men and encouraging black men to make gains at the expense of black women? James Q. Wilson, a political scientist on the right there, is the author of Broken Windows, the idea of broken windows policing. The idea that if you crack down on graffiti, you crack down on vagrancy, you crack down on panhandling, especially in poor areas, that this will end lawlessness in those areas and produce good normative law-abiding citizens. Now, you don't crack down on the 4 million fair housing violations that are enacted every year. The windows apparently aren't broken because of that. You don't crack down on the environmental polluters. You don't crack down on the bosses who don't pay the minimum wage and sometimes steal the wages and don't pay wages at all. You don't crack down on the slumlords. All of those violations of the law are not important to you. What's important to you are graffiti writers and panhandlers, but not all graffiti writers and panhandlers. Because believe me, you can write graffiti and panhandle and sit in the street with a container of beer in front of my house anytime you want. But you cannot do it in a ghetto, you cannot do it in a barrio. And so these are crimes of condition, not crimes of conduct. You're essentially criminalizing poverty through this. This is invented, learned, and legitimated in the university. The economics departments of every university advocated the artificial austerities that are wreaking havoc and creating social disintegration in the US and around the world. So this is the way broken windows policing for blacks is supposed to work. That if you crack down on small vandalism, somebody driving with an expired city sticker, that will stop urban, that if you don't crack down on it, it will lead to urban decay. People won't be proud of the neighborhood, and that'll produce crime, by which they mean robbery, murder, and rape, which of course are a small percentage of the things that people are locked up for. Most people locked up are jailed for nonviolent drug offenses, which themselves would not even be offenses if the same conduct takes place in a college fraternity house or at a yacht club. And so this crackdown on crime, this disguising racial injustice as if it's only an injury to black masculinity, it's learned here, and we've got to take it on here. I asked a colleague once to join with me in challenging somebody on our campus who uses Moynihan, who uses James Q. Wilson, who pursues a kind of sociobiology that says it's foolish to spend money on black kids because they don't have that much ability anyway. And I said, you know, we really have to take this on. And my colleague said to me, he said, well, you like to fight with people, but I don't. I think we ought to just live and let live with these people. And I said, well, if we live and let live with this kind of scholarship, we're actually killing people on 6th Street in Los Angeles. We're killing people in the 9th Ward in New Orleans. We're killing kids in Palestine and kids in Iraq. You know, we're destroying things. We don't have even imagining that you have the luxury to not engage with this is a grotesque class privilege, is deeply imbued with white supremacist assumptions. So in this society, thanks to Moynihan, thanks to James Q. Wilson, thanks to neoliberal plundering, women are asked to do the most but are helped the least. They have domestic centrality but economic marginality, and they are, instead of helped, they are punished and shamed and blamed for the conditions in which they're trying to raise their children. And so when you have something, again, what's often called the subprime crisis or the mortgage meltdown, the largest plunder of wealth from communities of color since slavery, since conquest, that no one goes to jail for, the people who are victimized by it are blamed for being unworthy borrowers and being undisciplined. But actual broken windows are not fixed. This is a real estate, this is a property owned by a bank that was foreclosed on. Properties in white neighborhoods have been fixed up and kept taken care of. Foreclosures in black neighborhoods, houses like this one are left with their actual broken windows not fixed. So when people say broken windows policing is great in Times Square in New York, and broken windows policing is necessary in Skid Row in Los Angeles, the most policed 1 square mile in the world, with 75 police officers and 50 DEA agents for a 1 square mile area filled with people with disabilities, people who are homeless, people with mental issues, people who are constantly living with housing insecurity but are arrested for jaywalking and sitting on the street and not moving. I said, well, where's the broken windows philosophy in the 30 cities around the country that the National Fair Housing Alliance surveyed and saw properties in black neighborhoods destroying the equity in everybody around them because the banks that own them won't fix them because they're in a black neighborhood? But there's, of course, another way of learning from New Orleans, and that is what the next 2 days, we're going to be hearing from the black resistance tradition of New Orleans. On the right there, you see Aretha Castle Haley. On the left, Jerome Smith, the big duck from whose activism goes from core up through tambourine and fan, that in fact, people who are broke aren't necessarily broken. People who are in struggle and suffering are not necessarily unable. And in fact, I think it's simply empirically true that in this society, the people farthest from the fruits and benefits of democracy have always been its most passionate defenders and its most creative implementers. And so if democracy is going to have a future, it has to come from the people who know totally what's at stake, who are the eyewitnesses to this dispossession, who out of necessity are already formulating solutions. What I'm trying to work against here is the academic tendency to sit in our offices, to sit in front of our computer and devise solutions for people we haven't talked to. In the days of SNCC, when SNCC started taking off, a lot of intellectuals of all colors came to the South, and they came with position papers, they came with analysis, they came with little loose-leaf notebooks of books saying what SNCC should do. And the great Willie Ricks, the SNCC organizer, said, "You brothers and sisters have it wrong. You think Mr. Say is in charge here, but down here it's Mr. Do." And so the sense of the people who are being the authors of their own survival, their own emancipation, is part of what we need to see. The Queen Mother Moore, who organized black men and women with guns to be in front of the Longshoremen's Hall so that Marcus Garvey could speak there in 1920. The Dry-80 Street boycott, one of the many sites of displacement in New Orleans, one of those places that was taken from black people and makes the displacement that Malcolm Gladwell celebrates such a continuing injury in the lives of people. The cultural activities, the Mardi Gras Indians and the tambourine and fan, and of course the great Tootie Montana, who 10 years ago at a meeting very much like this we invoked, because that summer in his last words, his dying words before the New Orleans City Council, he was talking about the police harassment of Mardi Gras Indians on the corner of Washington and LaSalle, and he pointed his finger at the City Council and he said, "I want this to stop." And this ought to still be our watchword, this ought to be our motto. So what I'm saying is this neoliberal crossroads is both poison and medicine. It can kill us, it can cure us, it depends how we use it. There's no evading it, and therefore we have no choice but to engage with it, but it is very, very dangerous. This current conjuncture is throwing forth not only new pain, but new polities, new politics. People are in the streets asserting their right to live, their right to define themselves in public ways that mark this as a turning point. This is the New Jersey Four who were imprisoned and convicted of essentially being black women who had non-normative gender identities and were convicted of being attacked. And instead of their attacker going to jail, they were sent to jail. This is the Diet High School hunger strike, which is at least a partial success in Chicago, where a community plan for a school that would teach a green redevelopment of the area was overturned by the privatized charter obsessed school system to create a school for the arts, because they didn't want black people planning and organizing their communities and using advanced technologies to create ecologically sustained development. They wanted them to sing and dance. And I love singing and dancing, and we ought to support the arts, but it was no accident that just as they don't put the community development high school in Washington Park in Chicago, they don't put but they put the School for the Arts. They put all the ROTC programs in the inner city schools, and the people in the suburban schools get the advanced track computer labs and special digital technology schools. It took a hunger strike by parents to stop this. This is important to us. This is masses in motion. This is a sign of a great refusal of an unlivable destiny. And everything we do ought to be figuring out how can we help the parents who wage this struggle. And of course, the struggle's not over. The school board in some ways capitulated and now is trying to take back that capitulation behind the scenes. As Clarence Lang and Jennifer Hamer point out, water is being shut off all over Detroit because the same privatization schemes that attacked public education in New Orleans, that lead to the city of Ferguson using black people as an ATM to finance city government when a Fortune 500 company, Emerson Electric, with $26 billion a year in revenues, sits there and pays only $68,000 a year in property taxes, that this privatization is happening everywhere, but it's producing a fight back. And we ought to be part of that fight back with the people in Detroit who have to fight simply to not have their water turned off so that the system can be sold for privatization. Again, another form of looting. The debt peonage in Ferguson, which has been well calculated, the mobilization in LA that's taking place right now. You can go on the website of the Los Angeles Community Action Network and sign a letter arguing that the new money allocated for the homeless has to go for housing, for health care, for infrastructure, for social needs, not just to lock more people up. So we're at a moment of oppositional conjuncture. New polities, new politics, masses in motion, people in the streets. They don't speak with one voice. They don't have one thing to say. We're going to have many disagreements among ourselves, but we can't sleep through this moment. You know, in one of his last talks, Dr. King is speaking to the striking sanitation workers in Memphis, and he starts going off on Rip Van Winkle. And people say, what in the world is Dr. King talking about with Rip Van Winkle in the middle of the strike? He said, you know, Rip Van Winkle went to sleep for 20 years. And he missed the transformative changes that were going on in his society. Dr. King was saying, don't sleep through this. Don't miss this moment. If you don't take action now, you may never have another chance. This is why the activity was so important to Dr. King, why he said, if you can't fly, run, if you can't run, walk, if you can't walk, crawl, but you have to keep moving. We cannot let this movement die, this movement of Black Lives Matter, of Say Her Name, the forums that have been held, now 25 of them around the country, in which relatives and friends of black women killed by the police have been coming forward to give testimony about the chaos that exists in their lives. It's not that black women and black men haven't been killed by the police all along, but we're at a moment where people are saying enough. People are saying basta ya. People are saying we have to do something about this, and it's up to us to do it. What we're developing is a counter-social warrant. If privatization, hostile privatism, defensive localism is the currency of the realm, people in the streets are formulating a new common sense, a new way of looking at the world, changing the frame, expanding the sphere of politics, building from insubordinate spaces like the ones that the representative of New Orleans groups work in. They're doing counterplanning from the bottom up, and they're pursuing what the great Chandan Reddy calls the logic of the illogical demand. A logical demand within the terms of this system is to live slightly better in a disintegrating world, to have slightly higher wages, to have slightly more comfort, to have slightly better representation of people who look like you in positions of power. An illogical demand, a demand that the system can't meet, is to fundamentally rethink agency, fundamentally rethink power, fundamentally rethink what leadership is and who's a leader, fundamentally rethink the social charter. So Jim Randles and Ashley Jones and Kalamu Yasalam, Tarian King are here, and they stand for a larger project in which they have organized this extraordinary curriculum that says we're for education for liberation, not mainstream socialization. We're not educating people to assimilate into a society that hates them. Kalamu talks about an educational system for black kids that will create students who lead rather than students who leave. And they have a way of connecting students to their own community, to people incarcerated from their community, to Jerome Morgan, who they helped get out of Angola prison, to think about we instead of me, to think about, to not accept this exceptional disposable dichotomy, and to refuse it, and to argue that if we're going to survive, we're going to do it together. This is the same thing that's guiding Project Row Houses in Houston's 3rd Ward. They had an art project that became a way of renovating homes that attracted attention, and it attracted the attention of gentrifiers. And so the temptation was, sell your homes. This is now an art district. You can get a lot of money for your homes. And they put up signs in the front of the houses, and these are houses owned by poor people, that says, third Ward's my home. It's not for sale. That the use value of a black neighborhood organized around black culture was more important than the exchange value they would get from selling off their homes one at a time and creating a new gentrified white neighborhood with a little black cultural gloss on it. When they re-renovated, they originally made these row houses into works of art, and then in a community meeting, people said, well, look, you have these houses of rows of art and people are homeless. Why don't you let people live in the houses? So they said, well, okay, we've got to turn the houses over to people to live, but who's going to live in them? Everybody needs housing. There's a dire housing shortage. Well, single mothers with children have a greater need for housing than other people. But there are too many single mothers with children for Project Row Houses to house. And so they had another meeting, and they said, well, what we think would be best, single mothers with children trying to finish college are getting skills and credentials that they can then bring back to the community. So we're going to open up these houses for residents to single mothers with children who are trying to finish college, and when they get their degree, they move out and another mother moves in. And in the film 3rd Ward, Texas, they interview one of these women, and they say, you know, look, you got free housing, and it wasn't just free housing. They decided that the one-at-a-time family model didn't work either, because a working mother who's going to school can't do all the things for children that are required, you know, getting shots certified for school, being in touch with certain nutritional things. So they used the project to fund what they call a mentor mom, who is basically a community worker who deals with 7 or 8 families and helps women raise their children in this situation. And so this is a demand. Instead of asking for upward mobility for individuals, instead of even asking for more investment in a poor area, which would have helped, they said, if we're not going to get investment from the outside, how can we make our area more valuable from the inside? And it's by sharing the space, sharing child rearing. They have a food co-op, a food garden. They deepen the value of where they are. In Los Angeles, the homeless activists for LA Can have been arguing, you don't make anybody safer by bringing more police to Skid Row. We want to have safety on Skid Row by having less police, fewer arrests, and more community programs.
And the police and the city council say, you know, who are you to be telling us this? Deborah Burton, Joe Thomas, you know, people who have no standing in society, have uneven histories. They say, no, this is what democracy means. We should be planning the environment in which we live. We've had enough of experts from the outside who have messed things up time after time. In Oakland, Reverend Daniel Buford and his allies have a program called Growing Equity from the Ground Up. They say most people in Oakland are descended from people who worked the land, and they're hungry. And yet there's plenty of land and plenty of sunshine in Oakland. It's not San Francisco. There's sunshine in Oakland. And so they've created this community gardens program in which they're trying to deal with the food insecurity of people in a food desert by involving a collaborative program where people not only grow food, but they have to come together and form a community around the growing of food. There's an East Oakland boxing club that young men come to because they want to learn how to box. And the person who runs it says, okay, I'll teach you how to box. But to get boxing lessons at the East Oakland Boxing Club, you also have to grow something. Because if you're going to be a fighter, you also have to be a nurturer. If you're going to tear something down, you have to learn how to build things up. And so these young people become boxers, but they also become gardeners. And when they become gardeners, they have a sense of project, a sense of achievement. They protect the space that they are, and they help feed other people. On the U.S.-Mexico border in San Diego, the Environmental Health Coalition has the Promotora program, in which they hire Spanish-speaking women, many of whom with very little education, to be health promoters and health activists in their neighborhood, to stop the metal plating shops that pollute the air and destroy their kids, to stop diesel trucks from idling at the docks so that the neighborhood gets poisoned. And then they decided it wasn't enough just to fight pollution. They had to have a plan of development for this whole region, including the part of it that's in Mexico, that would have security not for investors, but security for the elderly, security for the environment, security for women, security for children. In Oakland, on 8th Street, Asian immigrant women advocates developed an ergonomic chair lending library. These are women who work at workstations where the cloth they work with has formaldehyde in it. They get backaches and neck injuries because the conditions under which they do piecework are brutally oppressive to them. They lobbied and when they asked employers for safe chairs, the employers would just go out of business. And then come into business the next day as a shop. When you make a dress for Jessica McClintock or Lane Bryant, you never work for them. You work for Lucky Sewing, and you make a demand on Lucky Sewing, they're gone the next day. So they couldn't get it from the employers. They couldn't get it from the people they were actually working for. But they mobilized in an African politicized city to get the city to have a chair library so that they could check out a safe workstation and be able to come home without nausea and backaches and headaches. For us in the academy, and for all of us, I think the imperative here is one of accompaniment, going back to Ernie K. Doe. And I also here have to honor Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who had a theory of how people who are differently situated can accompany one another. But the key premise has to be that the people directly involved are the ones who determine the nature of the politics, and I would say the nature of the research. Universities all over the country now have community-engaged scholarship. And that's often a kind of poverty tourism or paternalistic meddling in communities. It's not actually engaged scholarship. An engaged scholarship that's equity-oriented, collaborative, community-based would be one where the research questions and answers are determined democratically by scholars and by community groups. And they're determined by having the groups indicate what their material needs are and having the scholars respond to that. The great George Rawik had this long ago. He said, either the oppressed continuously struggle in forms of their own choosing, or they're defeated by life. The things they're doing are not activism in the way that middle class and upper class people imagine it. They're the survival strategies of aggrieved people. Only they can know what they can and must do. So walking with New Orleans, I'm saying, encourages us, requires us to challenge dominant ideas, the broken windows, the Moynihan, the demonization of poor people, the idea that people with problems are the problems, the solution by experts from the outside, the technological fix to what are deeply political problems. It means we need to conduct research that is useful to social movement groups, not just about social movement groups, not just speaking for social movement groups, but that is useful to them, that provides them with tools that they need. Finding platforms and publication venues for activists. Every academic I know is at a university where people constantly moan that they're irrelevant, they're unimportant in society. They have budgets to invite speakers. Those budgets in the right hands could help groups that are doing things. They put out publications. They write articles individually that you can mention yourself and other scholars, or you can mention community groups. You have that choice. It matters a lot what's done with these platforms and publication venues. And also incorporating the ideas of aggrieved groups in research, writing, and teaching. Not just their experiences, not just their suffering, but their ideas. Everybody thinks, but not everybody has the social role of being a thinker. This is something Gramsci understood long ago. But to be a good thinker, you have to draw your ideas from the broadest possible pool of interlocutors. This is not a question of the university charitably or generously going out to the community to include other people. It's a way of recognizing that we have been destroyed in the university by racist and sexist and language exclusions that have artificially, arbitrarily, and irrationally narrowed the group of interlocutors. And so a small segment of society constantly speaks to itself about situations that it does not experience directly and doesn't think are important. And so my argument is that this is not service being done in the university. This is the quality control arm of the university. This is the guarantee of what good research will be. And then we need to seek funding for groups in motion. That we need to find ways in which the standing we have, one way or another, can be used for these ends. The great Ella Baker used to say that the key to all of this is find somebody who's doing something and help them. For us, I think it means in the university, I think it means a lot of listening, which I haven't done tonight, but I intend to do tomorrow. But I think it also means we need to have a new social charter, a new sense of who our interlocutors are, who we're learning from and learning with, who we're serving, who we're pleasing, and who we're displeasing. You know, we're often allowed, as Dr. King used to say, to comfort the afflicted as long as we don't afflict the comfortable. But I think it's time to take risks, to do something different. When I was in college, I used to go to the Rising Star Missionary Baptist Church on the 3400 block of LaSalle Avenue, mainly to hear the choir sing. And one of the songs that the choir sang was, "May the work I've done speak for me." Now, this is working people, people who 6 days a week had uniforms with their first names in script letters above the pocket, Leroy, Eleanor, people who cleaned other people's homes, who raised other people's kids, who served food they couldn't afford to eat, who made clothes they couldn't afford to buy. They were workers in that sense. But when they say, "May the work I've done speak for me," they were also talking about the work of fellowship, the work of accompaniment, the working at helping each other get through, not knuckling under, not bowing down, because if you lost hope, somebody else next to you would lose hope. That kind of work is something we can learn from. I think the work you do speaks for you, and to quote Sonny Patterson, I think we're at a point where we have to say, no break, no bow, push on, children, because freedom is now. Thank you.